Rich man forces simple elderly woman to play piano to mock her, but her talent leaves him speechless. In a lavish penthouse overlooking Central Park, Edward Blackwell swirled his bourbon, watching ice cubes dance in golden liquid. At 62, he'd built Blackwell Industries into a Fortune 500 company, with wealth that allowed him to collect rare art, vintage cars, and occasionally, people's dignity. Tonight's charity gala would be no different. Another opportunity to remind Manhattan's elite who held the purse strings. His phone buzzed. Mr. Blackwell. The caterers need approval on the menu changes. His assistant's voice trembled slightly. Whatever. Just make sure the Chateau Margaux is served at precisely 57 degrees. He hung up without waiting for a response. Edward straightened his custom tuxedo and glanced at his reflection. Perfect, as always. Downstairs, the ballroom of the Blackwell Tower gleamed under crystal chandeliers. New York's wealthiest mingled, champagne flutes catching light like liquid diamond. Edward moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations for hosting another spectacular fundraiser, though everyone knew only 10% of proceeds would reach actual charities. "Edward," called Margaret Holloway, chairwoman of the Metropolitan Museum Board, "you've outdone yourself. The quartet is divine. Only the best for my guests," he replied smoothly, noticing the elderly woman beside her. Dressed in a simple, outdated blue dress, she looked woefully out of place among designer gowns and bespoke suits. "This is Eleanor Phillips," Margaret said. "She volunteers at our community outreach program. I hope you don't mind my bringing her." Edward's smile tightened. This was exactly what he hated. Do-gooders bringing charity cases to his events. "How charitable of you, Margaret." He assessed Eleanor with barely concealed disdain. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, weathered hands, and unfashionable orthopedic shoes. "It's an honor to be here, Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying a slight southern lilt. "Your generosity toward arts education is admirable." Edward almost laughed. Did this woman actually believe the PR spin about his philanthropy? "Yes. Well, music is civilization's greatest achievement," he replied condescendingly. "Do you appreciate fine music, Mrs. Phillips?" "I do," she nodded, eyes brightening. "Very much so." An idea formed in Edward's mind, the kind of cruel entertainment he occasionally indulged in when bored. The string quartet had just finished their set, leaving the grand piano temporarily unattended. "Margaret mentions you're involved with the community arts program," Edward said, voice dripping with false warmth. "Perhaps you play an instrument yourself?" Eleanor hesitated. "Well, I insist you show us your talent," Edward interrupted, placing his hand firmly on her shoulder and guiding her toward the piano. He caught his friend Victor's eye across the room, giving a subtle wink. Victor immediately understood, smothering a laugh behind his champagne glass. The room quieted as Edward led Eleanor to the gleaming Steinway. He raised his voice to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat. Mrs. Eleanor Phillips has graciously agreed to perform for us." Murmurs rippled through the guests. Eleanor stood frozen beside the piano, her face paling. "Mr. Blackwell, I don't think—" "Nonsense," Edward whispered harshly. "You said you appreciate music. Surely you can manage a simple tune." His eyes narrowed. "See, unless you'd prefer I mention to Margaret how ungrateful you are for her invitation?" Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly. She looked at the piano, then at the expectant crowd. Slowly, she sat down on the bench, adjusting her position with the careful movements of someone with arthritic joints. Edward stepped back, anticipating the delicious embarrassment about to unfold. Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When her fingers touched the keys, the world changed. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the room, executed with such precision and emotion that conversations instantly ceased. Edward's smirk dissolved as Eleanor's hands moved across the keyboard with impossible grace. Her body swaying slightly with the building intensity of the piece. Her technique was flawless, but it was the emotion she conveyed that left the audience spellbound. Joy, sorrow, longing, and triumph flowed through her performance, telling a story without words. As she reached the thunderous finale, her previously timid demeanor had transformed completely, revealing a woman in complete command of her art. When the last note faded, silence hung in the air for 3 heartbeats before the room erupted in applause. Guests who moments ago had been smirking alongside Edward were now giving a standing ovation. Eleanor opened her eyes, looking almost surprised to find herself at the piano, and offered a humble nod. Edward stood frozen, bourbon glass halfway to his lips, utterly speechless. Margaret approached him, her expression a mix of amusement and disapproval. "You didn't know. Eleanor Phillips was once Eleanor Montgomery. She performed with the New York Philharmonic for 20 years before retiring to teach in community program." Edward couldn't respond. For the first time in decades, someone had made him feel small in his own building. Across the ballroom, Eleanor rose from the piano bench, acknowledging the applause with quiet dignity. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room. There was no anger in her gaze, no triumph, only a gentle understanding that cut deeper than any rebuke. Edward looked away first. The morning after the gala, Edward couldn't focus on work. Eleanor's performance kept replaying in his mind. He'd made a fool of himself, and worse, he'd tried to humiliate someone with more talent in her arthritic fingers than he'd acquired in a lifetime of wealth. "Your 9 o'clock is here," his assistant announced through the intercom. "Cancel it," Edward replied. "Cancel everything today." He grabbed his coat and left Blackwell Tower, walking aimlessly through Manhattan's busy streets. Fall had painted Central Park in amber and crimson, a stark contrast to the gray buildings surrounding it. Edward found himself entering the park, seeking something he couldn't name. Near the Bethesda fountain, a street musician played saxophone, the mournful jazz echoing off stone arches. Edward stopped to listen, noticing how passers-by dropped dollars into the open case. The musician nodded thanks without interrupting his soulful improvisation. Edward had always considered street performers beneath his notice. Now he wondered what stories they carried, what talents went unrecognized because they lacked the right connections or opportunities, or because people like him never bothered to look beyond appearances. His phone buzzed with Margaret's name on the screen. He almost declined before reluctantly answering. "Edward?" Margaret said without preamble. "See, I hope you're pleased with yourself." "Margaret, Eleanor won't be returning to volunteer with us. She was too embarrassed by last night." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Where does she live? Why? So you can humiliate her further." "Please, Margaret." Something in his voice must have conveyed his sincerity, because, after a long pause, she sighed. "Brooklyn Heights. But, Edward, she's a private person. Don't make things worse." An hour later, Edward stood outside a modest brownstone apartment building in Brooklyn Heights, feeling oddly vulnerable without his usual trappings of wealth and power. He'd stopped to purchase flowers, but discarded them, recognizing the gesture as inadequate. He pressed the buzzer marked Phillips and waited. No response. He tried again, and finally heard a crackly, "Yes, Mrs. Phillips. Eleanor, it's Edward Blackwell. May I speak with you?" The silence stretched so long he thought she'd walked away. Then, the door buzzed open. Eleanor's apartment was on the 3rd floor. By the time Edward reached it, slightly winded from the stairs, she was waiting in the doorway. She'd changed from the blue dress to simple slacks and a cardigan, but her dignified posture remained the same. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "This is unexpected." "I came to apologize," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he'd apologized to anyone? "My behavior last night was inexcusable." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Would you like some tea?" Her apartment was small but filled with warmth. Bookshelves lined the walls, and family photos covered every surface. A worn upright piano stood against one wall, sheet music neatly stacked beside it. No luxury items, no expensive art. Yet the space felt more like a home than his penthouse ever had. In the kitchen, Eleanor filled a kettle. "I wasn't offended, Mr. Blackwell." "You should have been." "Perhaps," she agreed mildly. "But I've learned that carrying anger only weighs down the bearer." She set 2 mugs on the table. "Besides, I saw your face when I finished playing." That was apology enough. Edward sat heavily in a kitchen chair. Margaret told me you won't be returning to the outreach program." That's on me." Eleanor poured hot water over tea bags. "That decision had nothing to do with you. My arthritis has been worsening. The program deserves a teacher who can demonstrate properly." Looking at her hands, Edward noticed the slight swelling of her joints that he'd missed before. "But your playing was perfect." "I paid for it afterward," she said matter-of-factly. "Today, I can barely hold a cup without pain, but it was worth it to play on such a beautiful instrument one last time." Her words landed like an accusation, though her tone held no blame. Edward felt shame burning behind his eyes. "I don't understand. If you were with the Philharmonic, why are you living?" He gestured vaguely around the modest apartment. "Like this." Eleanor smiled. "Classical musicians rarely get rich, Mr. Blackwell. My husband was a music teacher. After he died, medical bills took most of our savings." She shrugged. "But I've never felt poor." Edward thought of his empty penthouse, his loveless marriages, his estranged children. Who was truly impoverished? "Would you play something else for me?" he asked suddenly. "I'll understand if you refuse." Eleanor considered him over her steaming mug. Why?" "Because I want to listen properly this time." She nodded slowly and led him back to the living room. Sitting at the piano, she flexed her fingers carefully before beginning Debussy's Clair de Lune. The piece floated through the apartment, somehow more intimate and moving than her technical display the previous night. Edward closed his eyes, really listening, perhaps, for the first time in his life. When she finished, Eleanor remained at the piano, hands resting lightly on the keys. "Music was never about showing off for me," she said quietly. "It's about connection, finding the humanity in both composer and listener." Edward opened his eyes, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. "I think I've forgotten how to connect with anything." "It's never too late to remember," she replied. 3 weeks passed. Edward found himself making changes that surprised his staff and business associate. He canceled meetings to attend afternoon concerts at Juilliard. He revised the Blackwell Foundation's giving priorities, quadrupling funds for music education in public schools. And every Tuesday, he visited Eleanor in Brooklyn, bringing takeout from restaurants she could never afford, but insisting they eat on her mismatched dishes. She told him stories of her touring days, of playing for presidents and in great concert halls. He shared, hesitantly at first, his own stories of a childhood where achievement was demanded but never celebrated, of building a business empire to prove his worth to a father long dead. Today, he climbed the stairs to her apartment with nervous energy. The manila envelope in his hand contained papers that had taken considerable legal maneuvering to arrange. He knocked, but there was no answer. Edward frowned. Eleanor always waited for him on Tuesdays. He tried the door and found it unlocked, unusual for a lifelong New Yorker. "Eleanor," he called, stepping inside. He found her in the living room, seated at the piano but not playing, her hands curled protectively against her chest. "Eleanor? What's wrong?" She looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Just a bad day for the old joints," she said, attempting a smile. The doctor says it's progressing faster than expected." Edward set down the envelope and moved to her side. "Have you taken your medication?" "It makes me too drowsy to think clearly. I'd rather have the pain." She nodded toward the piano. "I tried to play this morning. Couldn't make it through a simple scale." Edward recognized the devastation in her voice. Music wasn't just something Eleanor did, it was who she was. And maybe with treatment. There's an experimental procedure, she interrupted, but insurance won't cover it. Of course. She squared her shoulders. I've made peace with it. Nothing lasts forever. Not even the ability to make music. Edward picked up the envelope. This wasn't how he'd planned this moment, but perhaps it was perfect timing after all. I have something for you. Eleanor looked at the envelope warily. Edward, if this is charity, it's not charity. It's atonement. He placed it in her lap. Open it. Inside were documents transferring ownership of a Steinway Model D concert grand piano to be delivered to any address of her choosing and paperwork for the Blackwell Medical Foundation's new Eleanor Phillips Fellowship, funding experimental treatments for musicians with debilitating conditions. Eleanor was listed as both first recipient and advisory board chair. Edward, she whispered, hands trembling as she read. This is too much. Actually, there's more. He pointed to the final page. The fellowship includes a teaching position at Juilliard. Limited hours, of course, and with an assistant to demonstrate when needed. They were quite excited when I mentioned your name. Eleanor stared at him. Why would you do this? Edward took her weathered hand between his. Because you showed me what real wealth looks like. And I'm tired of being poor. 6 months later, Eleanor sat at the gleaming Steinway on the stage of Blackwell Hall, the newest addition to Manhattan's performing arts venues. Her hands, while not fully restored, moved with newfound freedom after 3 rounds of cutting-edge treatments. Behind her, a youth orchestra comprised entirely of students from underfunded schools waited for her cue. The hall itself was a marvel of modern architecture, with warm cedar paneling and adjustable acoustic panels that could transform the sound for any type of performance. Outside, autumn leaves scattered across the plaza, where a bronze sculpture depicted hands of all sizes reaching toward a musical staff. Inside, the air hummed with anticipation as the last latecomers found their seats beneath the soft amber lighting. For the past 3 months, Eleanor had worked tirelessly with these 24 students, many of whom had never held an instrument before joining the program. She'd witnessed their frustrations and breakthroughs, their tears and laughter. During yesterday's final rehearsal, a young violinist had confessed to Eleanor that before joining the orchestra, she'd been planning to drop out of school entirely. Music gave me something to look forward to, the girl had whispered, and Eleanor had held those words close to her heart ever since. In the front row, Edward watched with uncharacteristic nervousness. The hall was his most personal project, designed not for prestige but for perfect acoustic, with half of all performances reserved for community programs and students. His hands gripped the program tightly, crinkling the expensive paper. So much had changed since that fateful night at the gala. The company still thrived, but he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations, shocking his board of directors. Life is too short to spend it all in boardrooms, he'd told them, ignoring their bewildered expressions. His ex-wife had called last week, curious about the changes she'd been hearing about. For the first time in decades, they'd spoken without bitterness. Eleanor nodded to her young musicians, then began the opening notes of an original composition titled simply Connection. As the students joined in, their initially hesitant playing grew more confident under her guidance. Edward watched the audience faces transform with the same wonder he'd felt at the gala months ago. The melody flowed through the hall like water finding its path, sometimes powerful and rushing, other times gentle and reflective. Eleanor had composed it specifically for these students, writing parts that showcased their strengths while accommodating their limitations. When the 14-year-old cellist from the Bronx began her solo, Edward found himself holding his breath at the raw emotion conveyed through her inexperienced but passionate playing. Throughout the audience, tissues appeared as discreetly as stars at twilight, dabbing at eyes that couldn't quite contain their emotion. A renowned conductor from the New York Philharmonic, who had come at Edward's invitation, leaned forward in his seat. his expression a mixture of professional assessment and undisguised wonder at what these young musicians had accomplished in such a short time. In the balcony, parents who had sacrificed precious work hours to attend clutched program booklets containing their children's names in print for the first time. A tangible validation of dreams they had sometimes feared were too ambitious for children from neighborhoods where arts funding had long been considered expendable. When the piece concluded, Eleanor stood carefully and turned to share the applause with her students. Their faces shone with pride and accomplishment. Many had never performed outside their school gymnasiums before. A tall boy with dreadlocks who played first violin stepped forward, presenting Eleanor with a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from community gardens across the 5 boroughs. The gesture hadn't been rehearsed. Edward could tell by Eleanor's genuine surprise as she accepted them, briefly pressing them to her face to inhale their fragrance before turning back to acknowledge the audience once more. As the applause continued, Eleanor sought Edward in the audience and gave him a small, private smile. He returned it, feeling an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. The man who had once collected possessions to fill the emptiness inside him was learning, slowly, to collect moments instead. Perhaps, he thought, as Eleanor took her final bow, some forms of wealth could multiply when shared rather than hoarded. Perhaps it was never too late to change the composition of one's life. And perhaps the most beautiful music came not from perfect technique, but from genuine connection. As the audience rose for a standing ovation, Edward stood with them, applauding not just the performance but the journey. Eleanor's, the students', and his own, from isolation to harmony.